Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it in silence. What brings you the deepest pleasure? Think of it. Hold it in your mind. Now let me ask you another question. Who gave you that? Because behind every pleasure is a hand, unseen, often smiling, that placed it before you. We are taught to chase pleasure as if it's the ultimate compass to a good life. We seek comfort, happiness, thrills, validation. We're told it's human, natural, right. But what if I told you that pleasure, more often than not, is a trap, sweetly baited, perfectly timed, and exquisitely delivered by someone who benefits from your surrender? You see, pleasure isn't just something we experience. It's something that is crafted, weaponized, and wielded. Empires have used it to pacify the masses, leaders have used it to mask tyranny, lovers have used it to control, corporations use it to addict. And most dangerously, you and I use it to lie to ourselves. What feels good isn't always good, and what looks like freedom often chains you tighter. Think of a lion in a cage, sedated by daily feeding. It doesn't need to hunt, doesn't need to fight. It's comfortable, safe, pleasured, and slowly it forgets what it means to be wild. It trades its fangs for food, its freedom for ease. Sound familiar? That's us. That's most of society. We become sedated by convenience, scrolling, consumption, numbing. We are kept in cages of pleasure, soft, velvet-lined cages we thank our captors for. But here's the truth. Pleasure isn't evil. It's just not innocent. It's a current. You either swim with purpose, or you are swept away. And those who understand this, those who study human nature deeply, they know exactly how to bend that current in their favor. If someone can control what you crave, they don't need to chain you. You will hand over your freedom voluntarily. The greatest minds in history knew this. They didn't seek comfort. They didn't bow to impulse. They studied pleasure the way one studies poison, how it kills, how it seduces, and how it can be used in the right dosage to influence entire civilizations. Imagine this, a ruler who gives his people enough bread to feel full, enough spectacle to feel entertained, and enough illusion to feel free. He doesn't need to rule with fear. He rules with pleasure, and the people love him for it. They don't see the chains, they kiss them. Ask yourself now, where in your life have you mistaken pleasure for power? Where have you traded your independence for approval, your discipline for dopamine, your truth for temporary satisfaction? Let me offer you something dangerous, not a drug, not a pleasure, but a question. What if you learn to deny yourself pleasure, not out of punishment, but out of power? Because once you do that, once you train your body and mind to function without needing constant stimulation, once you learn to choose discomfort over ease, silence over noise, depth over thrill, then and only then do you become untouchable, because now you control your cravings. Now you are the designer of your experience, not a victim of someone else's strategy. You are no longer a product of manipulation. You are its master. You begin to see with sharpness how advertisements play on your hunger, how false praise seduces your ego, how affection can be a currency, and how freedom is often just a more luxurious cage. And then something shifts. You stop fearing boredom. You stop needing approval. You stop chasing what everyone else is chasing because you've tasted something deeper, power over yourself. You walk into a room and you no longer need to be liked. You observe others not with judgment but with clarity. You understand why they do what they do, why they reach for pleasure like addicts, why they confuse love with attention, why they buy things they can't afford to impress people they don't respect. You've seen behind the curtain, you know the game, and more importantly, you no longer have to play it. But here's where it gets more powerful. Once you've mastered your own cravings, you can begin to design the world around you. Now you become the one who offers pleasure, who times it, who withholds it strategically, not to manipulate, but to lead, to teach, to disrupt. You speak less, but your words land deeper. You give less, but when you do, it matters more. Your energy becomes rare, and rarity breeds influence. People follow you, not because you gave them what they want, but because you reflect what they've never become brave enough to be. And when the world watches you, unshaken by temptation, calm in chaos, clear in purpose, they begin to question their own pleasures, their own cages, and some, just a few, will rise. And this is how revolutions begin. Not on battlefields, but in minds, not through noise, but through awakening. let's keep going. True pleasure often masks deeper manipulation and power dynamics. This idea, though uncomfortable, reveals a truth many resist confronting, that what we enjoy most is often precisely what blinds us to how we are being controlled. When we experience pleasure, whether it's emotional, physical, or intellectual, our critical thinking tends to dim. We become more trusting, more suggestible, more open to influence. Pleasure disarms us. It lowers defenses. It creates a sense of safety, which, in the wrong hands, can be used as a mechanism of subtle domination. The moment something feels good, we stop questioning it. We let it in, and that's exactly where the danger begins. Pleasure, at its core, is a response to reward. It activates the same neurological circuits in the brain that govern survival instincts. It taps into the ancient parts of us that evolved to chase food, sex, status, and shelter. In that way, pleasure has always been deeply intertwined with survival. But in the modern world, we no longer need to hunt to eat or fight to survive. Our pleasures have evolved into luxuries: streaming entertainment, social media validation, processed foods, likes, followers, praise. These pleasures are abundant, instant, and highly engineered to bypass rational thought and create dependency. This abundance creates a psychological vulnerability. We begin to associate pleasure with truth, comfort with correctness. If something pleases us, we assume it's good for us. But in reality, pleasure can be a facade, a carefully constructed veil that hides manipulation. For example, a company might design an app with vibrant colors, smooth interactions, and instant feedback, not to serve your deeper needs, but to keep you engaged, addicted, spending time and eventually money. That sensation of enjoyment you feel while scrolling is not free. It is the result of calculated decisions made by behavioral scientists and designers who know how to hijack your attention using pleasure as bait. In such systems isn't enforced through violence or threats. It's enforced through compliance born of enjoyment. The most effective control is the kind you don't resist, because you don't even see it happening. You welcome it. In fact, you seek it. A government doesn't have to silence its people if it can distract them with enough spectacle. A leader doesn't have to inspire loyalty if they can provide enough bread and circuses to keep the masses full and entertained. In this way, pleasure becomes a pacifier, something that prevents rebellion not through suppression, but through seduction. On a more personal level, consider relationships where one person showers the other with compliments, affection, and generosity, not out of love, but to secure influence. This is often how emotional manipulation begins. The manipulated person becomes attached to the pleasure of being seen, valued, and desired. Over time, they become willing to compromise their values, dismiss red flags, and tolerate mistreatment, all because the pleasurable highs have created emotional dependency. The pleasure felt was real, but it served a hidden function: submission, control, and emotional leverage. This manipulation is not always malicious. Sometimes it's cultural. We are taught from a young age that certain pleasures are good and should be pursued. We grow up in systems that reward obedience with praise, performance with applause, conformity with belonging. We learn to seek out these pleasurable responses because they tell us we're doing well. But the question rarely asked is, doing well by whose standards? The more deeply we chase socially approved pleasures, the more susceptible we become to external control, because our sense of worth gets tied to external validation, not internal clarity. Even in consumer behavior, the psychology of pleasure is deeply tied to power dynamics. Brands sell lifestyles, not products. They offer the pleasure of being seen a certain way, of belonging to a certain class, of projecting an idealized identity. And consumers, driven by that pleasure, willingly surrender their autonomy over their finances, over their choices, even over their self-concept. The marketplace doesn't need to force them. It just needs to seduce them with the illusion that buying is becoming. That wanting is winning, that pleasure is power, when in truth it's submission masked as freedom. In each case, whether it's politics, relationships, media, or marketing, The pattern is the same, pleasure is offered. Resistance drops, influence grows, and the person under its spell often never sees it coming. They feel good, and they assume that feeling good must mean they're in control, but the exact opposite is true. The more we depend on pleasure to guide our actions, the more we open ourselves to being shaped by those who provide it. The hand that offers you pleasure often holds the reins of your behavior. And unless you see it clearly, you will never realize that what you call freedom is simply a more comfortable form of control. Pleasure is a tool. Those who control it control others. This is a fundamental principle of power that is often overlooked because we are conditioned to believe that pleasure is personal, internal, and self-directed. But in truth, pleasure is frequently externalized and engineered. It can be designed, rationed, withheld, and dispensed like currency by those who understand its psychological leverage. The moment pleasure becomes predictable and programmable, it ceases to be a spontaneous joy and becomes a system of influence. And those who hold the blueprint for that system gain the ability to shape behavior, thought, and even identity. At its most basic level, pleasure activates the brain's reward system, particularly the release of dopamine. The moment that mechanism is understood and replicated, it becomes a lever. This is why entire industries, from tech to food, entertainment to politics, are centered around engineering pleasure and distributing it strategically. For example, social media platforms do not just allow you to connect, they control when and how you feel validated. They reward you with likes, comments, and shares at carefully timed intervals. These digital rewards become psychological hooks. You start checking compulsively, not because you choose to, but because someone else has learned how to stimulate your reward system just enough to keep you wanting more. The genius of this model is that it doesn't require force. It relies on addiction. The user believes they are choosing pleasure freely, but the truth is their pleasure is being managed from behind the curtain. Those in control are not just offering entertainment. They are collecting data, tracking patterns, refining algorithms to better anticipate and shape desires. In this way, the one who controls pleasure becomes a puppeteer, and the masses, though unaware, move to the rhythm of strings they cannot see. In politics, the same dynamic plays out on a societal level. A leader who understands the role of pleasure can maintain control without overt oppression. Give the people enough to eat, enough distraction, and enough comfort, and they won't revolt. Why would they? If they are entertained, mildly satisfied, and kept emotionally reactive through managed pleasure, national celebrations, public spectacles, carefully staged victories, they remain loyal. Their sense of well-being is tied not to freedom, but to the steady supply of stimuli that feels like freedom. This is not just governance, it is psychological domination through the regulation of pleasure. In personal relationships, control through pleasure can be even more intimate and dangerous. A person may learn what makes their partner feel good, words of affirmation, sexual attention, acts of service, and use those as tools of influence. The dynamic becomes transactional. I give you pleasure, and in return, you soften, you forgive, you comply. The giver of pleasure becomes a gatekeeper. The recipient, often unknowingly, becomes dependent. Over time, this dependency grows and the balance of power shifts. The one who controls the pleasurable experience gains the ability to modify behavior, to win arguments without logic, to assert dominance without aggression. This is how many manipulative relationships are sustained, not by fear, but by comfort. Even in education and parenting, the regulation of pleasure becomes a mechanism of control. Children are often taught to associate rewards, grades, praise, treats with obedience. They don't learn for the sake of knowledge, they learn to obtain pleasure. This pleasure-driven system trains them early to perform for external validation. As adults, this manifests in workplaces and institutions that reward compliance with recognition and punish rebellion with silence. Again, the organization that controls the distribution of pleasure, whether through bonuses, titles, or praise, controls behavior. Motivation becomes manufactured, not intrinsic. The most subtle and dangerous element of this control is that it often goes unnoticed. The controlled individual believes their actions are self-chosen. They feel pleasure and assume it came from within, never realizing that their environment was intentionally structured to produce that exact sensation. Pleasure is delivered in doses, and like a drug, the more someone receives it from an external source, the more dependent they become on that source. Eventually, they lose the ability to generate pleasure independently. They forget how to find meaning without validation, joy without entertainment, satisfaction without consumption. This is the ultimate form of control, when the one who distributes pleasure becomes the center of someone else's emotional world. In this way, those who master the mechanics of pleasure, its timing, its triggers, its effect on the psyche, hold immense power. They do not need to command obedience, they need only to create desire and fulfill it selectively. The people will come willingly. They will defend their dependency as freedom. They will mistake manipulation for love, distraction for joy, and comfort for autonomy. What they do not see is that the very pleasure they crave is the key in the lock of their own mental prison. And the one who controls the key controls everything. Blind pursuit of pleasure makes people easier to deceive and dominate. This is not merely a philosophical observation, it's a psychological fact. When someone is singularly focused on attaining pleasure, their ability to discern intent, analyze consequences, or detect manipulation becomes severely compromised. Pleasure becomes a lens that distorts reality. What feels good is assumed to be good, and anything that threatens that pleasure is instinctively rejected. In this state, a person becomes not only vulnerable to deception, but a willing participant in their own manipulation, mistaking it for freedom, satisfaction, or even love. Pleasure has a numbing effect on critical thinking. It relaxes the analytical mind and heightens emotional receptivity. This makes it a perfect vehicle for deception. If someone is handed what they desire, be it validation, comfort, status, or escape, they are far less likely to question the source or the motive behind it. Politicians exploit this by promising benefits that appeal to emotion while masking complex agendas. Corporations do it by packaging harmful products in pleasurable forms. Individuals in personal relationships do it by using charm, affection, or flattery to disguise selfish intentions. The deception doesn't have to be elaborate, it just has to be pleasurable. In this state, domination does not come through force, it comes through gratification. A population addicted to convenience and comfort is far easier to control than one sharpened by hardship and vigilance. When people are trained to chase pleasurable stimuli, likes on social media, approval from peers, bingeable content, they become conditioned to react. This reactive state replaces reflective thought. The brain, seeking quick dopamine hits, loses interest in depth, nuance, or long-term thinking. It prefers immediacy over integrity. That's how deception seeps in unnoticed, through the cracks created by compulsive indulgence. Even the illusion of choice becomes a tool of domination. People are offered different versions of the same pleasure, varied enough to feel autonomous, yet controlled enough to steer behavior. Fast food menus, streaming recommendations, political slogans, even fashion trends, all offer the appearance of freedom while reinforcing the same underlying structure. Choose your flavor of pleasure, but do not question the system that provides it. In this way, people feel in control of their lives when they are actually just cycling through pre-approved options designed to limit deeper thought and true autonomy. The blind pursuit of pleasure also erodes discipline, which is the foundation of self-sovereignty. Discipline requires discomfort, patience, and a willingness to delay gratification. But when pleasure becomes the dominant motivator, discipline starts to feel like punishment. The moment discomfort arises, whether in the form of silence, stillness, effort, or truth, the pleasure-addicted mind recoils. It seeks to escape, and in escaping discomfort it escapes growth. Over time, such a person loses their inner compass. They no longer act based on principles or values, but on what brings the most immediate relief or reward. This makes them easy to manipulate. Just offer a path of least resistance, and they will follow. Deception thrives in environments where people refuse to endure discomfort. Truth, by its nature, is often unsettling. It disrupts narratives. It demands accountability. But pleasure soothes, calms, reassures. So when people are given a choice between an uncomfortable truth and a comforting lie, the pleasure-seeking mind will almost always choose the lie, especially if it is wrapped in entertainment, affirmation, or indulgence. This is why entire systems of propaganda are built around pleasurable delivery. The message may be false, but if it entertains, flatters, or validates the listener, it becomes believable. On a deeper level, the blind chase for pleasure can even result in self-deception. People start to lie to themselves, not out of malice, but out of emotional convenience. They convince themselves that their habits are healthy, that their choices are rational, that their comforts are deserved. They construct belief systems to justify their indulgences. They avoid introspection because it might disrupt their carefully curated sense of peace. And as this internal dishonesty compounds, it becomes harder to distinguish real fulfillment from artificial satisfaction. They become trapped in a cycle of craving, consuming, numbing, and calling it happiness. This internal erosion of clarity and resilience opens the door to domination. When a person cannot sit with discomfort, they cannot stand alone. They become dependent on external sources to stabilize their emotions. That dependency can be exploited by individuals, ideologies, markets, or machines. The person becomes programmable. They can be guided, sold to, pacified, or enraged with simple stimuli. Their behavior is no longer rooted in will or wisdom, but in emotional reflex, and the tragic irony is that they often believe they are living freely when, in truth, they are simply reacting, always chasing, never choosing. In this context, pleasure stops being a gift and becomes a weapon. Not because pleasure is inherently wrong, but because it becomes dangerous when pursued without awareness. Those who do not question their pleasures are the easiest to mislead, and those who can be misled are the easiest to rule. The illusion of freedom through pleasure is more effective than control through fear. This is the brilliance of subtle domination. It does not require chains, walls, or force. It requires satisfaction, just enough comfort, just enough stimulation, just enough freedom to give the impression of autonomy, while the actual structures of control remain hidden. People who believe they are free do not resist. They do not question the system. They internalize the belief that they are choosing their path, unaware that the options presented to them were curated to shape behavior in predictable, manageable ways. This illusion begins with the promise of individualism, the idea that each person can create their own identity, make their own choices, pursue their own happiness. All of this appears liberating. But when pleasure becomes the primary measure of that happiness, the system doesn't need to impose limits. It only needs to define what is pleasurable. Through media, marketing, and cultural reinforcement, society begins to shape not just what people want, but what they believe they want. And once a person confuses internal desire with external suggestion, they no longer need to be ruled. They rule themselves in accordance with someone else's plan. The genius of this model is that it feels good. It offers comfort, ease, entertainment, and affirmation. It tells people they are special, while gently funneling them toward behaviors that maintain the status quo. Take the example of consumerism. People are led to believe that buying, upgrading, and owning are acts of personal choice, symbols of freedom. But in reality, those choices are shaped by algorithms, advertising, and cultural conditioning. The freedom to buy is celebrated, while the freedom to question why we buy is discouraged. As long as people are kept busy consuming, they rarely look behind the curtain to ask who is profiting from their pleasure. In the political realm, this illusion takes the form of controlled dissent and curated outrage. Citizens are allowed to express opinions, to protest, to vote, so long as the essential machinery of power remains untouched. The spectacle of debate and the drama of elections create the sensation of participation, but underneath it, the same interests continue to benefit. When people are fed pleasurable narratives, stories of progress, identity, pride, they feel engaged and empowered. But their engagement is channeled. Their voices are echoed back to them through filtered media designed to reinforce existing divisions, not resolve them. In this way, pleasure becomes a soft cage, padded and invisible. Even education, once a path to liberation, can become part of this illusion when it prioritizes comfort over challenge. A system that conditions students to value ease, to fear discomfort, and to chase validation through grades and praise creates adults who are ill-prepared to confront difficult truths. When learning is framed as something that must always be engaging, enjoyable, or rewarding, critical thinking atrophies. The result is a population that can absorb information but not interrogate it. They believe they are informed, but in reality, they are only entertained. This too is a form of control, one that requires no enforcement, just distraction. In interpersonal dynamics, the illusion of freedom is maintained through transactional intimacy. Many modern relationships are driven by the idea of mutual satisfaction. People seek partners who meet their needs, make them feel good, fulfill fantasies. But when pleasure is the foundation, relationships often become fragile because they are rooted not in commitment or growth, but in emotional transactions. As long as the partner delivers pleasure, the bond remains. But the moment difficulty arises, when sacrifice, honesty, or discomfort enter, the illusion begins to crack. What appeared to be freedom in love reveals itself as dependence on a performance. This same model scales up to the digital world, where people are given platforms, followers, and a voice. It appears as freedom of expression, but it is governed by invisible boundaries. Algorithms decide which voices are amplified and which are buried. The reward of likes and attention becomes a system of behavioral reinforcement. Users learn, often subconsciously, to say what pleases others, what fits the mold, what aligns with popular narratives. They call it expression, but it is expression shaped by the pursuit of digital pleasure. The system does not silence people, it seduces them into silencing themselves. What makes this model so powerful is that it eliminates resistance by removing the need for confrontation. There is no need to jail a body that is already captured by desire. No need to censor a voice that is preoccupied with being liked. No need to fear rebellion from a population that is numbed by constant stimulation. The illusion of freedom, when mediated by pleasure, becomes the most efficient and elegant form of control. It doesn't ask for submission. It simply creates the conditions where submission feels like choice, and in this space people no longer seek to break free. They ask for more comfort, more pleasure, more of the very chains they can no longer see.